This is Modern Mindset, the show that picks the brains of the world's leading minds to help you unlock yours. I'm your host, Adam Cox, and joining me today, we have entrepreneur Kam Johal. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Kam, we've been connected for a while, and I'm always impressed with your professionalism and what you aim to do in terms of having an impact on people's lives in a positive way. I think sometimes when people are successful in business, they can make it all about themselves and kind of fall into that ego trap of just kind of buying more and more expensive things. But what's evident with you is that there is a real desire to help other people. But before we get into that, give us a bit of a background in terms of your story, because I think a lot of people have preconceived ideas that if people are, let's say, financially successful or done well in business, that it's because, you know, maybe their parents have made it easy for them and it's been an easy ride. But what's your story? How did you kind of build your empire?
It's interesting, isn't it, that we all want to be successful, and yet when we see somebody that's successful, we actually dislike them quite a lot for that success. So, but anything, nothing could be further from the truth, Adam. I came here when I was 10 years old to join my family. We're quite a middle-class family back home in India. And so all of a sudden, in the days when I came, racism was rife. Nobody waited till your back was turned to call you something. They called it to your face. So life was tough. I couldn't speak the language. I was a smart kid, but all of a sudden you have this kind of disability almost, not being able to communicate with those around you. And there were not a lot of people, of my background at the time. I think I was the only boy in the whole of my school year that had an Asian background. So it wasn't like you could identify with your own community. So, it was tough. And I only went to school for 6 years in this country. I came here when I was 10, at 16, considered to be not the brightest person on the earth. I was in the bottom class every single year. And my parents, obviously, they're immigrants. They're trying to establish themselves. So they're not going to fight the system and say, hey, our kid's in the wrong class, which I did for my son much, much later. And, but, you can't take ambition out of somebody. I always wanted to do well. And I started my first business when I was 24 years old. I've never looked back. But, the days when we started out, it was literally 7 days a week. And I didn't, I don't sort of bleat about that because I feel like a victim or something. I wanted to be successful, and that's what it took. And I just did whatever it took to be successful.
Do you think that some people are kind of, they're born entrepreneurial? Because, for me, I never had this kind of idea that I'd be an employee. I was, having little businesses when I was kind of 14, 15 years old, similar age to you when I set up my first proper business. For me, I can't think of a reality where I would be happy being an employee my whole life. Do you think some people are just kind of born entrepreneurial?
I think it's, for me, I kind of saw it at about 15. So prior to that, I'm still adjusting to being here. It's a completely new life for me. And at about 15, I had an uncle of mine that took me to Worksop Market on a Saturday in Nottinghamshire, and he just needed some help. And my parents both worked, they're employed. My dad was in an engineering factory. My mum worked in the hosiery trade. A lot of Asian people, especially Leicester. And soon as I started seeing what he was doing and how he lived, I just couldn't get enough of it. I was like a sponge at 15. So I don't know whether other people are triggered by an event in their lives, or they're just, like you said, born with it. But as soon as that happened and I saw that, there was no way I was going to work for anybody for any longer than I had to.
Makes sense. So what were those first kind of business ideas? Because I think, some people know that they don't want to work for other people, but they don't necessarily know what kind of industry or what kind of business they're going to do. What were some of those early ideas? And then what did you end up actually doing?
It didn't matter. I just didn't want to work for anybody else. I knew that. So that was a fact. And then it didn't really matter what I was going to do. So Uncle Ron, and I have so much respect for him, and I still do to this day. He was the one that actually gave me these ideas in terms of what to do. So when I finally started my own business at 24, I just went back to him and said, Uncle, I want to start doing the markets, which is what he did. And he said, yeah, great, no problem at all. I bought an old ex-police van for £1,000, and away we went. It was that simple. And I think that today, with what's going on, people get bogged down with business plans and these, amazing ideas and forecasts and all the rest of it. I think when you're a kid, it doesn't really matter, especially when, like, you started at 14, 15, washing cars takes a bucket and a sponge, right?
Mm.
You don't need a business plan for that. You just need to go and knock on a door and say, can I wash your car?
It's the action that's the important thing. And I think, for me, it was, I learned more actually going out and doing it, and then figuring out that actually you're making a lot of mistakes, but they're all fixable. You always kind of learn something from everything that happens. And that kind of desire to go out there and do it. Because I don't know if it's the same with your journey, but with my journey, when you have a little bit of success in business, people start asking, oh, how do you do that? And what do you do? But a lot of the time, they're not asking because they want to do what you're doing. They're kind of asking almost to validate their own preconceived ideas about what they want. So they want to hear that it's risky, or they want to hear that it's kind of cautious, so that they then think, no, I'm doing the right thing. What's some of the questions that people were asking you when they saw you kind of 24 years old having a business? Were they kind of inspired by that, or were they kind of a bit protective and they're like, Kam, are you sure you're doing the right thing here?
By the time I was 24, I don't know how I managed to do this, but I managed to convince the former known, we call it the depot these days. It was called B&Q, it's owned by Woolworths. And I went to London and I managed to convince them to put me on their graduate training scheme. So I had quite a good career by that time, and I'd become new stores opening manager for them. And then suddenly I decided to come to Leicester, and I wanted to be in my own business. So I was this suited and booted guy that my community would see, this young man that was really going to flourish. And all of a sudden I was a market trader. And I remember my mum saying, you don't wear a tie anymore. You remember those days, right? And you don't shave anymore. And I said, Mum, when I used to work for that company, I looked successful, but my pockets were empty. I said, now I look like a scruff, but my pockets are full. It's great. And people, I think, as you said, I think we interpret messages for whatever we want them to be. The message is the same, and we take it in differently. So those that wanted to be entrepreneurs were asking for a different reason, and they got that answer, and they took the same answer that we often give, and they interpreted it as their permission to start, if you like.
True.
And those that were risk averse and didn't want to start probably saw the fact that, look at this guy, used to be in a suit and tie, going to work, and now look at the state of him. Because images it's very important, and it's never changed, and even more so with social media going on.
The way I reconciled it for me, because when I set my first proper business up, I was 23 years old, and I made a bit of savings from working in sales originally. But I reconciled it on the basis that to take that money and invest it in a business, if the business did well, then I'm kind of set for life, and I've kind of built up this kind of asset. But if it didn't, I would probably learn more from that journey than the same amount of money if I invested it in a business degree or something like that. So for me, it was kind of like, whatever happens, I'm going to win from this situation. So when other people were looking at me and they're saying, well, this is a very risky thing to do, I think when you're in your mid-20s, it's not really risky, because you're going to learn so much, and you can always go back. In your case, you could have gone back to the corporate world. You could have gone back to these kind of big things, probably more valuable than when you left, because of what you'd learned with your own business. But to the outside world, quitting, a conventional job and then being self-employed, it looks really risky, and it looks reckless at some levels. So obviously your mum was a bit worried about you. Was there anyone else, or even voices inside your own head that said, are you sure you're doing the right thing here? Or was it just you knew it was the right thing and you were happy doing that?
No, in my heart, I always knew. Since I met at 15, when I met Uncle Ron, my parents were very much, you should go get a job and be safe. And I understand that, because parents want to love you and they don't want you to get hurt. But there's this, there's a voice in your head and there's a feeling in your heart that just wants to go, and what you can do. And if somebody asked you to write it down on a business plan, you wouldn't have a clue. But you knew that you were going to muddle through. And and what you said really resonates. I was reading a piece by Steve Jobs recently, and he said exactly the same thing, that they started Apple computers, I think they were 20 years old. And he said, if we failed it and didn't do anything, we could always have gone back to college and done a law degree afterwards. So I think, you can make these mistakes when you're younger, because you will bounce back and you will be stronger. than ever. I was married at the time when I started, and it was actually money that my wife had that we used to start this business. We bought a house with virtually 100% mortgage. And so, her idea was that we use her money to furnish the house. I said, listen, we can furnish the house later. Let's start a little business. And that's where it kind of started. And so what? If we'd have lost all that, she was working at the time, it would have meant that we bought the sofa a year later. Big deal.
Yeah. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people don't really understand. The risk is lower when you're younger, when you start a business, because effectively there's less people depending on you. Who I really admire and I think is true courage are people that have had a corporate job for like 20, 30 years. And at the age of 45, 55, then they decide to run a business, because then at that point, they've got a whole different background, and then maybe they've got a mortgage, maybe they've got dependents, but that's real risk at that point in my mind. That's real courage. So what happened after you're 24 years old, you're building this business? Was it all smooth sailing, or was there a few hiccups on the way?
Something, it went so quickly. And, I ended up within about 4 or 5 years, ended up with 4 retail shops selling ladies' wear. And we were turning over about £1 million a year. But, and then of course, I started compensating for the fact that people had said that you're never going to be any good, bought myself a brand new car and all the trappings. And you think this is how business is, because I hadn't learned anything. It just happened to me. And so recession came along, I think it was 32, and we ended up getting kicked out of the shops. And, my wife went back to work. And that was the lesson. I'm really happy that happened. It wasn't present at the time, but today that was the making of me, of who I am today. So, we came out of the shops, we had some stock. So I went back to selling that on the markets, didn't have any money. And there was a huge second mortgage on my house. I had a limited company, but I didn't understand how those worked. And people around me, there was nobody to guide me on that. So I paid back all my creditors and didn't pay my own second mortgage. And you'd never do that today, because, the reason that you have a limited company is that there's protection for you. But I just didn't know. And so I drifted around for about 3 years. And I realized that I needed to learn what business and how money works. And I decided to train as a financial advisor. So I went back to school, found a company that would sponsor me, and the money was absolute pittance. I don't know how we got through. But I did all my financial services exams, and I was a financial advisor for 6 years. For 3 of those as an independent financial advisor, where I started advising small companies. And that really were very, very important lessons as to how a business is run. And I started reading at them. I started reading and all the typical books of Rich Dad, Poor Dad and Think and Grow Rich and all of those. And to date, I've probably read about 400 books, and I continue to read, and mostly self-development, mostly business. And financial services in 6 years taught me how money works around the world on a bigger scale than I could ever have learned just by reading. So those were my lessons, and those were really the making of who I am today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are so many different belief structures and kind of value systems around money, that money isn't really anything other than what you kind of think it is and how you treat it. So, for you having a background in business, I'm sure you had a different kind of lens to look at what money is and how to invest in money than perhaps someone that had only ever had paid employment, because you're looking at it as, immediately assets that generate revenue and therefore cash flows that then come in. Already you're looking at it from a different perspective than the average investor that, in my experience, look at it from speculation. Like, if it goes up, you've won, and if it goes down, you've lost. It's a very simplistic way of looking at money. You're now, I'm sure, quite into investing. What are the principles that you learn from business that you think are most useful when thinking about investing?
There's 2 forms of investment. There's passive and active, in my view. So there's money that you give to somebody else that they invest on your behalf, and you get back. So that's typical pooled investments that are around in financial services. And one of the reasons I came out of financial services was that very reason, that why can't a top graduate who's got the best education, beat the FTSE 100 average? because costs are so high, So I've learned that, I don't now give my money to somebody else to invest and then hope that they then make a return, take their bit and give it back to me. So, but those kind of investments are sometimes the only ones that are open to somebody that's got a career and working at that. So what do they do? So the other investments that I picked up very, very quickly was investing in property. And so, and the difference between those pooled investments is you put £100 in and immediately they take their charges out first and invest your £95 or whatever that is. Whereas with property, you put your 25% in and you got this other 75% that you borrow from a lender. Now you've leveraged all of that money because the lender only asks for the interest back. They don't ask for any profit back. So they're not a partner in that. So, the principles that I've learned is that I don't really invest in other people's businesses any longer because I've lost too much money. And I think diversification, once you've actually got some real money, don't try and diversify when you've got little bits of money. Keep it in the best place that you possibly can. And learn about money, educate yourself. Too many people read the adverts and then follow that advice rather than educating themselves. I think it's so important. It's a vital part of our lives. And, and you alluded to it earlier, money's a tool to get you the things that you want. That's all it is. But, if you haven't got enough of it to buy those tools and things, and today, we've got inflation now that rearing its ugly head after 10 odd years. And we've got energy prices going through the roof and the average working family can't make ends meet. Well, the thing is, instead of sitting there watching soaps and making other people rich, because that's what they are, they're products that are sold and beamed into our homes. Why not spend a little bit of time educating yourself about something that's really important? And, and a lot of people are lacking enough money just to make ends meet. And I still have this sort of immigrant mentality of coming from India and thinking, this is a first world country. Nobody should have issues around money in a country like ours. We're the 5th largest economy in the world. So something is fundamentally wrong in terms of, if we've got a household and finances are not working. I was listening to a gentleman, I think it's Steve Bartlett, that's just gone on Dragon's Den. And he was talking about the fact that he used to beg for food and go into restaurants and look in bins and things. And one day he went into a chair that had some money in it in a restaurant and realized that they didn't clean those out and found £13 and a few pennies. And the first thing he did was went to McDonald's and spent it all there, right? And he said the lesson that taught me was that the problem for people that are financially challenged is that they often make poor financial decisions.
True.
So he said, I could have gone to a budget store and bought food for 3 or 4 days with that money, but just wanted to treat himself. So perhaps I think we need to look at ourselves and take a bit more responsibility in terms of what we're trying to achieve, and have we got the tools to actually do that?
I mean, you alluded to it there about kind of leveraging other people's money to buy property, but I think one of the key things that I found that are a big difference between people that tend to accumulate assets and build wealth and those people that don't are their attitude to debt. And typically the kind of people that tend to struggle with money tend to take on credit card debt and loans to buy the kind of things that Rich Dad Poor Dad would say, kind of liabilities and kind of things that make you feel good, but holidays, cars, that kind of stuff, but not necessarily appreciating assets. Whereas I think for people that particularly have come from a business background, they look at other people's money as an opportunity to leverage that money to buy assets that could then appreciate in value and potentially generate cash flow as well. Do you tend to use that strategy? Are you using other people's money, not necessarily just in property, but in other areas as well to kind of continue to kind of build your wealth?
I don't do that so much of that today. So property for me is a store of wealth that gives you a little bit of return. So, property growth at 5-7% is probably average, and a yield of, if somebody's getting 10% return on property, they think that's absolutely fantastic. What I find is a trading company can turn over money very, very quickly. So I've always had multiple businesses that at one point had 24 companies. So, an injection of cash, whether it's borrowed or not, and it's often been borrowed. So I've taken bank money because it's usually the cheapest money you can get. And they don't ring you up every day and say, how's my investment doing?
True.
Right? So I've leveraged that. So I've used my assets to secure that, because banks won't lend you money most of the time, or not significant sums of money, until you've got something that they can secure their lending on. So I've always been fortunate in the sense that I bought my first home when I was 24. And, as the equity in that grew, I had a company. And then from that, I then leveraged and bought some properties, but the deposits for those properties were essentially equity that built up in my home. And then it's the circle starts. But I would today, if I was starting out again, I think we've got information age businesses that all you need is a laptop and a Wi-Fi connection to start. True. Those ideas of having bricks and mortar businesses are great, but they're expensive and they're not mobile. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in this new information age for people to start businesses. And if I was starting out, and again, one of the things that I did when I started my first business, I had a full-time job. So I came back to Leicester. The first thing I did was got a full-time job, even I knew I didn't want to work for anybody. But somebody's got to pay the bills. Yeah. And then I used to have a day off on a Friday. So I used to go and do my market on a Friday. I enlisted the help of a very dear relative of mine, Paul. And I said, listen, let's be partners. You're working full-time. So he would take the same van out on a Saturday, and then we'd both go out on a Sunday. And what that meant, Adam, was we didn't need any money out of that business. So we were both getting salaries. And so we just put everything back in. And in about, I think it's about less than a year, I then gave up my job to do that full time. And the decision that was made for me to give up my job rather than Paul is that he actually earned a bit more money than I did. So I said to him, listen, Paul, as long as we can equal my salary that I get from my job, I'll go full time. And so he said, yeah, no problem at all. Which one of us does that? I said, I actually take home less money than you. So let me give up the job. And then it's less of a strain on the business itself. So, you can start anything part-time. And that's what I would do today.
Yeah. And it's a great hedge against risk if you do things part-time. Because, and also I think the world's changed, that some of the preconceived ideas about what you need to do to set up a business aren't there. When I set up my first business, I had the perception of being a much bigger business by having a serviced office in Covent Garden, a phone number with 4 zeros on the end that made it look like a massive kind of corporation. And the perception was I was this kind of big agency, but actually I was running the business from a 1-bedroom flat in Luton. And it was only when the revenue came in from that company, then I started kind of taking a bit more risk and kind of buying things. It's even easier these days because people don't need a physical place to work. You can literally work from your own home. And I think the pandemic has shown that actually a lot of these preconceived ideas about people needing to be in offices or needing to be in certain locations turned out wasn't true all along. People can kind of run their business from pretty much anywhere. You have a group that you run which encourages people to make £10,000 a month in income. What's the significance, do you think, of that figure? And what are some of the strategies that people find are actually effective at doing that?
I started that business, started the group because I just wanted to prove more probably to myself as much as anybody else. And I wanted to hold myself accountable that you can start with relatively little money and actually get to that figure. So 10K, is branded about very often as sales propaganda, make this much money. But the fact is, it's actually scientifically proven that at that kind of level you're the happiest. So it might be 9K, it might be 11K. So I'm not arguing the science behind it. But if you look at any research, that's the kind of figure that as human beings, once we get to that, the happiness index increases. And if you suddenly have 20K, you're not twice as happy.
True.
So happiness for a human being doesn't increase proportionately as money increases there. The other thing is, when I was in business, in terms of my children were in school, and the most expensive that my life was, that's the figure that I paid myself. and we ran our house beautifully. So unless you've got some really nasty habits, it's more than enough money to be able to run your life well and give you choice. Because I think the thing is, as a successful individual living in a first world country, what you don't want to do is you do not want your decisions to be based around, can I afford this? And I'm an off the chart alpha male in terms of trying to look after my family. And so I don't want to say to my child or my wife that, oh, we can't buy it because we can't afford it. And there's no need for that. And that's the kind of figure that you need to be able to, like I said, you can't buy an airplane or have a yacht on £10,000 a month, but you can certainly have, a couple of nice cars. You can have a really nice home and educate your children properly, and, have a choice of where you go to eat. And if that's a burger bar, that's great because you've chosen that. But if at the same time you want to go to, a Michelin star restaurant, you can go and do that. And that's really where that figure comes from. Because as I said, it's enough money for most of us to live pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. There is diminishing returns. There is a point at which you could spend even more time, even more of your energy and emotions to get to 15 or 20K a month, but it isn't going to make you happy, and probably would make you less happy because that time and attention is going away from, people that matter, your friends and family and that kind of stuff. And what are the kind of things that, because I would imagine, looking at it from your perspective of, you've got a group of lots of different people, you probably see the ideas that are kind of ideas that don't necessarily work and don't get people to 10K, and then the consistent ones that do. Are there particular types of businesses that are more reliable at helping people that may not have, lots of kind of cash to get going, to actually get them to that point where they've got 10K a month?
It's Adam, the number one thing that will make you fail is your attitude. Right? We've already discussed that today. You don't need a lot of money to get going. You don't need an infrastructure of an office, etc. I'm sitting in my home now, which is where I work from. I've given up my office, so I'm really enjoying it. And this is where I started a business when we first moved here, in the study of this house. And exactly like yourself, I hired a call center. And I would have my clients say, Cam, how many people have you got working there? Because different girl picks up the phone every time I call. I said, oh yeah, I think there are about 30 of them. It was just me. In terms of people coming with ideas, as long as it's flushed out well, if there's a market for your idea, because the thing is, what you've got to do is you've got to do something that you really like and love. The only question is, can I monetize it? So is there a market for my, if you can turn your hobby into something that you make money from, then it never feels like you've done a day's work. Sure. So I don't think that anybody needs to have this great idea. You're probably already doing something. So a lot of people, as you know, they work in a certain industry, and then they go and set up in business for themselves. And, if you've got an attitude, an open mind, and you can work the hours that it takes to get a business off the ground, and I think it's got to be that, whatever it takes kind of attitude. And I'm sure you've had days in your life when you think, God, I don't really feel like it today. And we all have those. But all I see from the group of people that we've got is, number one, most of them that come into that group and the questions that they ask are not about, I've got this great idea. It's about, oh, what do I need to do to get to 10K? And how do I do it? And particularly when I first started coaching, I coached in property, and people would come and say, yeah, Cam, I want to do this in property. And I said, why do you want to be in property? And very often they couldn't actually answer that question. They just thought it was a good idea to get into that business because they'd seen somebody else make some money out of it. And so when you break it down, think, because we're not talking about beautiful architectural buildings when we're talking about buy to let, they're usually 2 up, 2 down, pretty run down places. So nobody's interested in that. There are houses that I own that I have never even been to see. So I think it's when you've got a passion for something, that makes it a lot easier to succeed in that. And the other thing is that 10K, if you put that as a goal for say 2-3 years time, that's when it's going to work for you. So the ideas of, you're not going to make 10K a month next week. Nothing is a get rich quick scheme. And if it is, it's usually illegal, right? So don't be getting involved in any of that kind of stuff. Follow your heart and sit down with somebody that can actually talk to you about turning that into a business. I've been on a 3-day course as I'm always learning, and somebody came up with this amazing idea that I could follow in the business that I do. And about an hour later, I discovered that it wasn't really going to be monetized to a level that I need. So, good idea isn't necessarily going to work in the commercial world.
True. The other thing that we share in common is that, towards, the middle of our lives. So like for the majority, let's say, of our adult lives, we both drank alcohol. And then later on, we've made the decision not to drink alcohol. I'm curious where your decision came from. Because obviously, it seems like a decision you're very happy with, and it's had lots of kind of like positive impact on your life. But where did that decision come from, and how has it affected your life?
I'm a Sikh by religion, and we're very into alcohol, into community. So we gather, men separate to one side and women and children over there. And we're predisposed to drinking alcohol. And of course, our country here encourages it from the culture of going to the pub, as it were. So I was part of that. And then I spent my life since the days of being an IFA in hotels and restaurants with business owners. And then I spent, after my days as an IFA, I spent 10 years traveling to and from Dubai up to 30 times a year. And again, in hotels, restaurants, and airports. And gradually, my relationship with alcohol changed. I didn't really start drinking until about 24, 25. When I first got married, we didn't even have alcohol in the house. And so gradually, it got worse and worse and worse, to the point where, I would have a meeting at lunchtime, have a drink, and then I would drink in the evening. If I've had a drink during the daytime, I'm always going to drink at night. And it got to the point where I wasn't really enjoying it anymore. I drank far too much, far too many times. And my relationships at home with my family, with my children, with my wife were deteriorating fast. And I wasn't really happy with the way, the direction that my life was taking. And in 2018, we had a very large estate agency business in Leicestershire, along with a few other businesses, which my wife suggested that we should give up one of the businesses. She said, you can't keep starting new things and not stop something. So I said, look, what's the one business that gives you the most aggravation? Let's get rid of it. And she said, the estate agency. I said, great. And the decision was made that quickly, Adam, right? So we had a little conversation. There was a couple of people that had already approached me for buying it, rang them up, and within 3 months we'd sold it. And at that point, I didn't really know what I was going to do. It coincided with my twins graduating that year. They turned 18 and graduated about the same time that we made this decision. So I knew that from a financial point of view, I was secure. And then my outgoings were going to dramatically decrease, because obviously I'm no longer having to fund twins at university. And so I then thought, what do I want to do next? And before I decided that, I thought, the one thing that I don't want to do is I don't want to take the same me into the next part of my life. And so I thought, what is it that I can change about me? And I knew that it was something that I needed to change, rather than the outside world is not going to change for any of us, right? So it's only our perception, our own thoughts and ideas. So I thought, what is the one thing that I can change? And this is my self-talk. I'm not talking to anybody. I'm not discussing it with anybody. What's the one thing that I can change that would change my life like that? And previously, I'd given up alcohol for a month or 2 or 3, and we all did dry January and things like that. And in 2015, there was a time when I didn't drink for 8 months. And I suddenly realized how productive I was, how clear-headed I was. I did everything on time, went to bed on time, went to the gym, brushed my teeth every night, right? And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to do that? And that was really it. I started writing, and it was like that kind of red pill, blue pill moment for me. Mm-hmm. And I journal most mornings. So I started writing about the path that my life would take over the next 5-10 years if I continue to drink. And one of the things that really struck me, Adam, was that my children would now be adults. They would not be financially dependent on me. So the choice of them coming to see me or being with me was up to them now. They're no longer children, they're adults now.
Sure.
And so would they continue to make that choice if I was that kind of dad, because alcohol is very self-absorbing, and we drink it to be happy and merry, or to get rid of stress, but it only adds those things, and I'm sure you'll agree with that it only adds to depression, it only adds to you being in a bad mood. And so my daughter was going to graduate after my son, so he graduated on a Thursday in July, and she was going to graduate on the Tuesday. And my relationship with my daughter was at the point where I thought she was going to say to me, Dad, you don't need to come to my graduation. And I had a decision to make at that point. So I could have used that to beat my whole family that I'd paid for the education, and I did this and I did this, and be the victim and say, you didn't let me come to the graduation. And I knew that it was that far away. Or I could do something about it and think, right, come on, let's be positive. So we went to Exeter, and my son graduation, I was drinking that day on a Thursday, and we went to Holly's graduation on Tuesday, and I actually gave up drinking that Saturday. So my first dry occasion was actually my daughter's graduation, where alcohol was flowing quite freely. It was something that I felt that would add to my life, not take away.
And since that decision, did it turn out to be the case? Were there moments kind of like afterwards that everyone's maybe drinking around you, having a beer, having some champagne, and you're like, why did I make that decision? Or did it kind of reaffirm, I'm so glad I made that decision? What's happened since then?
I think both things happened, when in the early days, certainly, and of course, when you're trying to give something up, there's more of it that turns up.
It's everywhere.
4 or 5 weeks. I went to a wedding 2 weeks later, and all the old guys that I used to drink with were going to be there. And, but I had a plan. I thought, if I get overwhelmed, I'm going to leave the function. So the thing for me was just planning it out and see what I was going to do. If I knew I wanted to give up, I was done with drink, and it was just the difficulties of getting through. Then I think it's 4 or 5 weeks later, we had the only barbecue we've ever had for the twins' graduation, about 50, 60 people in the house. And of course, alcohol's flowing. And I got challenged by a couple of the guys that I used to drink with, what's wrong with you? It's your kid's graduation, and blah, 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 and all the rest of it. And I actually owned it at that moment. I said to them, look, because one of them said, let's see where you are in a year's time. I bet you were drinking. And I said, look, whether I'm drinking or not doesn't really matter. The fact is, today I'm not. And I'm happy to supply you with alcohol, and I don't care what you drink and how much you drink. But at the end of the day, it's my decision. And today I'm not going to drink, and that's all there is to it. And when I look back at that, Adam, I kind of owned my decision that day. And I knew, and the other thing is, of course, is that you're setting yourself up now, because these are the guys you've been drinking with, and they're never ever going to let you forget if you start drinking again. And so early days were hard. Today, every day I see signs of why I don't drink and how happy I am. I'm much happier in myself as a person. I think I've achieved far more than I would have done had I continued down that path, because I could have quite easily retired at that point when I sold that business. And I think maybe I would I'd definitely not be doing what I'm doing today. And the success that I've had in terms of other parts of my life are just, you can't quantify it.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And I think that there are always things out there that will challenge any decision that you make to say, you sure you're really happy with this decision? And it sounds like you've encountered a few of those. For me, when I look back on it, I don't know if you remember the Disney film Dumbo, where Dumbo's got the pink feather and is convinced that the pink feather is the only reason it can fly. For me, alcohol was that pink feather. It was a belief that I needed it to be confident in social situations. I needed it at some level. It was a crutch. And actually, now almost 3.5 years without alcohol, it totally was just a belief system that, I need alcohol to be okay. once you completely own the decision, then actually you kind of realize that there are a lot of mirages and kind of false beliefs linked to, whether it's alcohol or any other decision that you make. But sometimes you have to get far enough through that kind of decision to see that actually it was kind of false all along. A lot of the kind of promises that alcohol is meant to kind of do, it quite often not only doesn't live up to what it promises, but actually contributes to the direct opposite in many cases. Is it fun? Well, in a lot of cases it causes arguments, sometimes it causes violence, a lot of accidents that lead to kind of injuries and death are kind of alcohol fueled. So is it this fun thing, or actually is it, something a bit more kind of sinister? Is, a lot of people use it as a dependency. And the truth is it can be either of those things, and I quite like it when people are drinking alcohol around me, because that's their choice and I can respect their choice. But if I'm willing to do that, then they need to respect my choice that I don't drink anymore. And then that's the kind of the balance. You also run a club encouraging and inspiring people that, for those that do want to make that choice to give up alcohol, what are some of the tips over time that you feel, if someone's watching this and they're kind of like, I've got a bad relationship with alcohol as well, what are some of the 2 or 3 tips that are the most impactful that you think that could actually get people to not just make the decision but stick to that decision?
The thing that really helped me the most was having written down my 2 paths, as it were. So I wrote down what would happen if I continued, or what could happen, and what could happen if I stopped. And obviously, if you're going to create a good story, then I made the path of continuing to drink a little bit darker than it would have been, perhaps, and the other way around. And it's like painting a picture for yourself, because if you number one is, if you decide to do something, then you want to give yourself the best chance of success. So in the early doors, I kept away from all of my friends that used to drink, and I didn't go into pubs and all of that kind of thing. I really nurtured and looked after my sobriety. And so the big thing for me was, I went on a lot of walks. We had a beautiful summer in 2018. So sometimes 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 times a day, I'd go out for a walk and just really be very conscious of why I was doing this, and keep the big picture in mind. Because I'd quit before, and all I'd say to anybody that's thinking, if you think you've got an alcohol problem, you've got an alcohol problem, right? Because you don't think about, I've got a banana problem. So and people come and say, Kam, I don't know that I've got an alcohol problem. So, well, why are you talking about it if you haven't got a problem? So, what I would do is, number one is we've got a great group now. There's 600 people in there. And it's fantastic in terms of, you can come and ask your questions. It's totally free. I do a Friday night live in that group now, because I thought that's the time. It's a Friday night and a Saturday night, perhaps, especially in early doors, when all your mates are out drinking, you think I might be missing out on something. So we do a little bit of supporting work in that, in terms of people coming along and asking questions. But I think keep the big picture in mind as to why you're doing it. And then, write down the dark days and just look at them when you're thinking of having a drink. One of the things I used to love was going to the gym on a Saturday afternoon, and going to a beer garden after that. Nights you showered, you had a workout, and nothing nicer than sitting in the sun. And now all I picture is going to the gym, sitting in the sun, and them being all sweaty and slurring. So I focus on that part instead of the nice part of sitting in the beer garden having a drink. So, and I think the way that I kind of really kept it together at the moments when I was tempted was the aftermath of that, the hangover in the morning, or the arguments at night, etc., etc. And a lot of people I meet, Adam, and you're probably exactly the same, it's quite extroverted, that, never really realized you drank. You were such fun when you had a drink. And I said, yeah, I was absolutely the life and soul of the party. But I've got to admit something, I was curled up on the passenger seat in my car whilst my wife had to drive this drunk man home. So that's the part that other people never see. And you've got to get honest with yourself and think, is that the man or the woman that I really want to be?
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. Some people are very good at kind of drinking in moderation, and they can kind of drink in small amounts, enjoy themselves, in which case they don't have a drink problem. There's absolutely no reason at all for them to quit. But I think for certain people, and I think for those people that may, be attracted to kind of business and things like that, what effectively they're doing is they're taking big risks quite often. There is that kind of belief in themselves. And unfortunately, one of the things that alcohol does do, it does act as a temporary solution to stress and anxiety and kind of emotional issues. And typically, people more attracted to business tend to have more responsibilities, and therefore they have more stress and more things that could go wrong, and that kind of stuff. So I think sometimes the people that tend to have a bit more on their plate tend to have a different relationship with alcohol. And certainly in my world, 9 times out of 10, I'd be absolutely fine with alcohol. But it was the 1 in 10 times that I wasn't, that I'd think, shit, what did I say? What did I do? I've got this raging hangover. And the only times in my life where I was really reckless would have been when I was under the influence of alcohol. And I've got a great life. And I kind of think, how can I fuck this life up? Well, I'll tell you what, how I could do it: drink too much, and then perhaps drive while I'm drinking, or perhaps get in a fight out for no reason whatsoever. And it doesn't take a lot for your life to take a very different turn if you're not fully in control of the decisions that you're making. And for me, I tend to evaluate risk in quite a rational way. And it's kind of like, what's the potential consequences of my life direction here? Kind of like your two paths kind of approach. Well, there is a situation. I'm spending a lot of time in jail, or I'm spending a lot of time, kind of injured or paralyzed or something like that because of this choice. Whereas that would be virtually impossible on this different path. And therefore a lot to gain and a lot to, a lot to lose by sticking on that path, a lot to gain by kind of switching it. So for me, that was my motive. And certainly I've never looked back. And, people say, will you ever drink again? And it's kind of like, well, look, there is a possibility, but I can't see it. There isn't that kind of desire. Whereas before, I think alcohol was meeting a need, and now it totally isn't meeting a need, which I think is it potentially means that if I did drink alcohol, I'd have a completely different relationship with alcohol, because I've realized I don't need it. But equally, because I don't need it, I don't want it. So, it kind of changes. If someone's listening to this and maybe they've been inspired by your kind of business path and kind of your attitude to money and that kind of stuff, or maybe, it's about increasing monthly income, or maybe about, kind of changing their relationship with alcohol, what's the best way that they can learn more about you, or perhaps join one of these groups?
Groups free, they're on Facebook. Come and join them and participate. I'm on all the usual channels in terms of LinkedIn, Facebook, and the groups that I've set up are specifically for the 10K and alcohol-free living. And just come and join, have some fun, reach out to me. I always make time available to talk to people, because I've never forgotten that, people helped me up along the way. Zig Ziglar, never forget, that man taught me an awful lot. So if you see a turtle sitting on a fence post, it didn't get up there by itself, right? So, and I'm a big believer, Adam, in this thing that, that I want to hold the ladder up for people to climb up after me, not pull it up. And a lot of people forget where they came from. I don't know what the reasons are for that, but they have their own reasons. I'm still the same person that came off that plane when I was 10 years old. And if somebody needs a hand, I'm in a very privileged position. I realize that, and it never lost on me the choices that I've been able to give to my family. But it all came from that entrepreneurial mindset and opening that mindset up to learning. And I think especially for younger people, it's easy, and we've been there, the bravado of, I know that, what does this old man know? Well, that old man or that old lady's lived a life that you're going to go down, and you're going to have the same, but we're not that unique. You take the same set of actions. You drink too much, like you said, you're either going to end up in a fight or you're going to end up in jail. All right, one day it'll happen, and we're not that far from those things happening. So, get active in your life. Don't be a spectator. The biggest thing that the world is doing right now is they're convincing us, big companies, corporations, are spending billions of dollars convincing us that we're weak and we need their product every day to be happy, to be healthy. You don't need anything. You're strong. Your maker made you to handle everything. We've got billions of years of development. This brain knows everything. We've been through it all. You can handle anything. We survived caves and saber-toothed tigers, right? We can navigate Facebook and Insta, can't we?
Put it that way, it seems very plausible that we can. Kam, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And to you at home, thanks for joining me on Modern Mindset. See you again soon for more.